A pregnant, single mother with a baby walks into a store hoping to buy at least some food. But when the shopkeeper notices that she doesn't have enough money, he rudely throws her out into the street. The woman is ready to leave with her head down, but at that moment 2 shoppers, whom no one expected to see, intervene. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The neon sign flickered weakly above the small grocery store's entrance, casting a dim red glow onto the cracked sidewalk below. It had been there for years, buzzing faintly in the quiet of the night, unnoticed by most who walked past. The store itself sat on a corner, wedged between a laundromat with a perpetually broken dryer and a pawn shop with barred windows. This part of the city wasn't dangerous exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. It existed in a space between survival and struggle, where people moved with their heads down, shoulders hunched against the weight of their days. Inside, the air smelled of stale bread and overripe fruit. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an artificial glow over rows of sparsely stocked shelves. The linoleum floor, once white, had faded into a patchwork of scuff marks and stains that no mop could erase. The aisles were narrow, with canned goods stacked haphazardly, some brands long discontinued, their labels curling at the edges. Behind the counter sat the store's owner. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with thick fingers that tapped impatiently on the cash register. His face was lined, not from age, but from years of scowling. He had owned this store for more than 2 decades, and in that time, he had learned to recognize the types of customers he preferred, those who came in, paid without hesitation, and left without conversation. The others, the ones who lingered too long, who counted out crumpled bills and loose change, who hesitated at the register, those were the ones he resented. The chime of the door announced a new customer, and he glanced up, already prepared to gauge whether this one was worth his time. A woman stepped inside, moving cautiously, as if she was afraid of disturbing the stillness. She was young, no older than 30, but exhaustion weighed on her features. Her long coat hung loosely on her frame, and beneath it, the curve of her stomach showed clearly. She was pregnant. A small boy, no older than 4, clung to her side. His small fingers curled into the fabric of her coat. His shoes were worn, the soles barely holding together, and his tiny frame was wrapped in a jacket a size too big. The woman hesitated just inside the entrance, glancing around as if deciding where to begin. Her eyes flickered toward the shelves, scanning the prices before she finally stepped forward, leading the child with her. She moved quietly through the store, her movements careful, as if she didn't want to take up too much space. She bypassed the more expensive items without a second glance, selecting only the essentials: a loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, a bag of rice. The boy, trailing behind her, stopped for a moment near a shelf of cookies. His eyes lingered on a small package of chocolate chip biscuits, and for a moment he reached for it. His mother noticed. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, and she shook her head ever so slightly. He understood immediately, lowering his hand, placing the cookies back with quiet resignation. He didn't whine, didn't protest. He simply followed her toward the register. The store owner watched all of this with a practiced eye. He had seen it before: the silent calculations, the subtle hesitations, the quiet disappointment of those who had already accepted that they couldn't afford anything more. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his unshaven jaw, waiting. When the woman reached the counter, she carefully set her items down and reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out a small handful of bills and coins. She began counting them, her brow furrowed in concentration. The store owner exhaled sharply through his nose. He already knew what was coming. The woman's lips parted slightly as she recounted the money. She wasn't sure yet, but she could feel it. She was short, maybe by a few cents, maybe by $1. Her stomach tightened as she glanced at the cashier, knowing that asking for understanding would do no good. The man behind the counter shifted, his patience thinning. He leaned forward, glancing at the money in her hand, then at the items on the counter. His mouth pressed into a hard line. The woman took a breath, hoping, praying that it would be enough. She reached out, trying to slide the loaf of bread closer, as if finalizing the purchase. And then the store owner stood. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back, the sound abrupt and sharp. The boy flinched, pressing himself against his mother's leg. The woman froze, her hand hovering above the bread. The store owner was already shaking his head. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes said enough. This wasn't a charity. This wasn't a place for people who didn't have enough. She opened her mouth, an apology forming on her lips. But before she could speak, he stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. His voice cut through the silence, sharp and unyielding. The woman's face burned. The other two customers in the store turned their heads slightly, pretending not to watch. They had seen moments like this before, and none of them wanted to be involved. The boy looked up at his mother, confusion and fear in his wide eyes. He didn't understand the words exactly, but he understood the meaning. They weren't welcome here. The store owner crossed his arms, waiting. For a moment, the woman thought about arguing. She thought about pleading, about telling him that she had every intention of paying for what she could. But she could see it in his face. He had already made up his mind. Without a word, she lowered her gaze, took her son's hand, and turned toward the door. The boy hesitated for just a second, glancing back at the counter where the bread, milk, and rice still sat untouched. Then, feeling his mother tug him forward, he followed. The chime of the door rang again as they stepped outside into the cold night. Inside the store, the owner exhaled, shaking his head as he settled back into his chair. The two other customers remained silent, looking down at their own groceries, pretending they hadn't seen anything. The fluorescent lights continued to hum overhead, casting their cold, artificial glow over the nearly empty aisles. And outside, just beyond the glass door, the woman stood still, gripping her son's hand tightly, her shoulders trembling as she fought against the weight pressing down on her chest. She had expected this, and somehow that made it hurt even more. The cold air hit her skin the moment she stepped outside. It wasn't the biting cold of winter, but the kind that settled in during late autumn, creeping through thin fabrics and whispering through cracks in the pavement. The woman, still clutching her son's small hand, exhaled shakily. She didn't let herself cry. Not here, not now. She had spent too many nights reminding herself that breaking down wouldn't change anything. Her son looked up at her with wide eyes, his little fingers curling tightly around hers. He didn't say anything, but she could feel the question hovering on his lips. Why couldn't they take the food home? Why did the man inside speak to them that way? Why did people look away? She squeezed his hand gently. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned to leave, willing her feet to move, but she hesitated. The night was stretching out in front of them, and their apartment, barely more than a single room with a flickering heater, was still a long walk away. The thought of carrying her son home, exhausted and hungry, made her stomach clench. Just a few moments. Just enough to catch her breath. She leaned against the brick wall beside the store, closing her eyes for a second. The dim glow of the streetlight above cast a faint golden hue onto the sidewalk. Inside the store, the owner had already moved on. He was back in his chair, his expression set in stone, as if nothing had happened. The two remaining customers had finished their browsing and were standing at the register, exchanging quiet glances but saying nothing. The city moved around her, uncaring. Cars rumbled down the street, their headlights washing over the pavement in brief flashes of white. The faint sound of music played from a passing vehicle, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. Somewhere nearby, a couple walked by, laughing, oblivious to the moment that had just unraveled inside the store. And then, just as she prepared to step away from the store's harsh glow, the door chimed again. She didn't turn at first. She had no reason to expect anything more. But then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone stepping out onto the sidewalk behind her. It was only when she felt the shift in the air, the subtle presence of someone standing nearby, that she glanced to the side. The man who had just exited the store was tall, with an easy but commanding posture. His clothes were simple. Dark jeans, a plain jacket zipped up against the cool night air. But something about him felt familiar. His face was partially shadowed by the dim lighting, but his presence alone was enough to make the air around them feel different. He wasn't just another customer. And then she saw the woman who had followed him. Elegant, yet understated, she had the kind of presence that was impossible to ignore. She stood beside the man, her dark eyes moving carefully over the scene as if reading every unspoken word in the air. The woman recognized them at the same time as the realization dawned on the store owner, who was still inside, watching from behind the counter. Barack and Michelle Obama. It was almost surreal the way they appeared at that exact moment. The store owner, for the first time that evening, hesitated. His fingers, which had been drumming idly against the counter, stilled. He knew who they were. Of course he did. And suddenly, the air in the store felt heavier. The other customers turned their heads, finally acknowledging what was happening, their faces flickering with recognition. One of them, a middle-aged woman holding a basket of canned goods, parted her lips as if to say something but then quickly pressed them shut. Outside, the woman with the child felt herself stiffen, unsure of what to do. Her son, unaware of the shift in atmosphere, simply stared up at the two figures standing before them. Barack glanced at the store, then at the woman. His gaze was calm, steady, not accusing, not pitying, just quietly observant. He had seen the whole thing. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. The store owner swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. He had spoken so freely just moments ago, his words filled with irritation and finality. But now, with Barack Obama standing just outside his store, the confidence in his voice was absent. Michelle's gaze didn't waver. She wasn't looking at the store owner yet. Her attention was on the young mother and her child. There was something knowing in her expression, something deeply familiar. She had spent years working with struggling families, sitting with single mothers in community centers, hearing their stories. She had grown up knowing hardship, understanding the way the world could press down on those who carried too much weight alone. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She already knew. The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the quiet street. Inside the store, the cashier sat frozen, unsure whether to speak or to pretend he hadn't noticed the growing tension. The two remaining customers had completely abandoned their own concerns now. One of them, a man in his late 40s, shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on the carton of milk in his hand. He had been here the whole time. He had seen what had happened, and yet he had done nothing. And now the entire situation had changed. Barack took a step forward, moving just enough that the dim glow of the store's neon sign illuminated his face more clearly. It was a look the world had seen many times before. Measured, thoughtful, unshaken. But beneath it, there was something else, something firmer, something that hinted at a quiet, unwavering sense of right and wrong. The store owner finally exhaled a sharp, uneasy breath. He had no idea what was about to happen next, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one in control of the moment. The air inside the store had shifted. It was the kind of change that didn't come with loud voices or slammed doors, but with a silence that carried more weight than any argument. The store owner, still behind the counter, shifted his stance, suddenly aware that the power in the room had slipped away from him. He wasn't used to that. Barack stood just outside the door, his posture relaxed but deliberate. He hadn't spoken yet, but he didn't need to. His presence alone had already altered the trajectory of the night. Behind him, Michelle stood with the same quiet authority, her gaze steady as she took in the scene. The young mother remained frozen in place, her son still clutching at her coat. She wasn't sure if she should stay or leave. The humiliation of the past few minutes still burned hot under her skin, but now something else was creeping in, the undeniable awareness that the moment wasn't over. Inside, the two remaining customers were no longer pretending not to notice. They were watching intently now, though they did so carefully, as if trying to measure whether they should involve themselves. Barack moved then, stepping through the doorway with the same ease as someone walking into a familiar space. The door chimed behind him. The store owner stiffened slightly. For years, he had run this store exactly how he wanted, without interference. He made the rules. He decided who was worth his time and who wasn't. But suddenly, the lines he had drawn so firmly had blurred. Barack walked slowly toward the counter, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked to the untouched groceries, bread, milk, rice, the things that had been denied. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket. The crisp sound of a bill unfolding was the only noise in the store as he placed a $100 bill onto the counter. A heavy pause followed. It was a simple gesture, but it carried an unspoken message. Barack wasn't asking. He wasn't negotiating. He was correcting. The store owner's jaw tightened. He looked down at the money, then back up at the man standing before him. For a brief second, the stubbornness in his face flickered with uncertainty. Michelle took a step forward then, her presence just as commanding as her husband's. She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. Instead, she turned slightly, letting her gaze sweep over the other people in the store. People who had been here the entire time, who had witnessed the moment but had chosen silence. And then, just as quickly as Barack had placed his money down, something shifted in the air again. The middle-aged woman standing near the refrigerated section moved first. She pulled out her purse, hesitating only briefly before adding a $20 bill to the counter. No one spoke. The man behind her, still clutching his milk, followed suit. He dug into his pocket, retrieving a few crumpled bills and set them down. Another pause. Then another customer, a younger man near the entrance, reached into his own wallet, pulling out what he could. He didn't look at anyone directly, but he stepped forward, adding to the growing pile of money. It was small at first, individual actions, quiet and unforced. But as each person made their choice, The energy in the store shifted from passive observation to something heavier. Solidarity. The store owner's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to protest, to push back, but the weight of the moment had already pressed down on him. This was no longer just a transaction. It was a decision, one made not by him, but by the people who had allowed his rules to exist unquestioned until now. The mother, still standing outside, had barely moved. Her son looked up at her, confused, watching as more and more people contributed to something he didn't fully understand. And for the first time that night, she felt something other than exhaustion. She felt seen. Barack finally spoke, his voice steady but quiet. This should cover their groceries. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was final. The store owner's fingers twitched slightly, his gaze darting to the pile of money on the counter. His mind raced, trying to calculate how to regain control of the situation. But the numbers didn't matter anymore. Not tonight. Not in this moment. And as Barack stepped back, making it clear that he wouldn't press further, the tension in the room reached a tipping point. The store owner exhaled through his nose, his shoulders tightening. He knew what was happening, even if he didn't want to admit it. He was being challenged, not through force, not through threats, but through something far more powerful, a shift in expectation. The weight of a dozen silent judgments now rested on him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just the one making decisions. He was the one being watched. And that was something he wasn't used to. The silence inside the store felt different now. It wasn't the uncomfortable hush that had filled the air before. It was heavier, charged with an unspoken challenge. The store owner, still standing behind the counter, stared at the pile of money in front of him. He wasn't counting it. He wasn't even looking at it as currency. He was looking at it as something else entirely. A statement, a shift. A moment where control had slipped from his grasp. Barack didn't say anything else. He had made his point without raising his voice, without anger, without force. That was the most unsettling part for the store owner, how effortless it had seemed. This wasn't an argument. This wasn't a fight. This was something worse. It was a reflection. A mirror had been placed before him, showing him exactly how he had treated a struggling mother and her child. And now everyone in the store had seen it too. The other customers had stepped forward, not with words, not with protests, but with quiet actions that spoke louder than anything else could. The weight of those actions pressed down on him, squeezing his chest, making it hard to breathe. For years, he had run this place the way he saw fit. He had decided who was worth his time, who deserved patience, who was taking up space. He had believed that he was doing what needed to be done, that the world worked a certain way, and he was just playing by the rules. But tonight, those rules had changed. He looked at Barack, then at Michelle. She was watching him with that same piercing, knowing gaze, not condemning, not pitying, just waiting. The cash register sat in front of him, waiting for him to make a choice. For a moment, his pride burned hot inside him. He wanted to push the money back across the counter, to tell them all to leave, to take back the control he had lost. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the fact that his customers, had sided against him. Maybe it was the quiet expectation in Barack's eyes, the way he wasn't forcing anything but was still daring him to do the right thing. Or maybe it was the small boy, still clutching his mother's coat, watching everything with wide, confused eyes. The store owner's throat tightened. Without a word, he reached forward and grabbed a paper bag from under the counter. The sound of crinkling paper broke the silence as he unfolded it, pulling the woman's groceries toward him. Bread, milk, rice. With careful, deliberate movements, he packed each item neatly into the bag. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He hated this, the vulnerability of it, the feeling that he had lost something, even as he did what he knew deep down was right. When he was done, he placed the bag back on the counter. He didn't look at the mother. He didn't look at Barack. Instead, he just let out a sharp breath and muttered, "Take it." The words were gruff, begrudging, but they were said. Outside, the mother hesitated. She had seen cruelty before. She had heard words that burned and cut. She had learned to expect that kindness often came with conditions. But this moment was different. She stepped forward slowly, her hands still trembling slightly as she reached for the bag. The boy watched in quiet amazement as his mother took the groceries, the food they had almost walked away without. She didn't say anything at first. Her voice had been caught in her throat since the moment she had been told to leave. But when she finally found it, she looked at Barack, at Michelle, at the strangers who had stepped forward for her, and she whispered, "Thank you." Not to the store owner, to them, to the people who had changed the outcome of this night. Barack gave her a small nod. Michelle reached out briefly, resting a gentle hand on the mother's shoulder. It was a simple touch, but it carried so much with it: understanding, reassurance, silent encouragement. The boy, still holding tightly onto his mother's coat, finally let out a small breath. His eyes flickered toward the counter, toward the small package of cookies he had wanted earlier. And that's when something unexpected happened. A hand reached forward. It wasn't Barack's. It wasn't Michelle's. It was the middle-aged woman, the first customer who had stepped up to help. She grabbed the cookies without hesitation, placed them on the counter, and pushed another $5 bill toward the store owner. Her voice was clear, steady. "These two." The store owner hesitated. He had already lost control once tonight. Did he really want to let it slip further? But he had no choice, not anymore. He took the money, scanned the cookies without a word, and added them to the bag. The little boy's face lit up. For the first time that night, hope flickered into existence. The mother held the bag close, clutching it like something precious. She turned back toward the door, toward the night, her child at her side. She didn't look back at the store owner. But as she stepped outside, something changed. The moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been in that store, the other customers, the ones who had made a choice. The store owner left standing behind his counter, his thoughts heavier than they had been in years, and Barack and Michelle, who had simply done what they always did, lead by example. As they stepped outside, the street felt different. The cold air didn't sting as sharply. The neon glow of the store sign didn't seem as harsh. Michelle glanced back once through the store's front window. The owner was still standing there, looking down at the money on his counter, his jaw tight, his hands flexing slightly. He was wrestling with something, maybe guilt, maybe shame, or maybe, just maybe, the first seeds of change. Barack exhaled softly, slipping his hands into his pockets as they walked away. Behind them, the young mother was already heading down the street, her son holding on to her tightly, a small pack of cookies clutched in his tiny hands. Tonight had been a victory, not because of money, not because of power, but because of humanity. And for those who had been in that store, whether they had stepped forward or had simply watched, the lesson would not be forgotten. Because kindness wasn't just something you did. It was something you chose. And tonight, the choice had been made. The store's door swung shut behind them, the soft chime of the bell echoing into the night. For a moment, the city seemed to pause. The young mother stood just outside, holding the bag of groceries close to her chest, her son's small hand gripping the edge of her coat. She wasn't sure what to do next, whether to speak, to turn and leave, or simply to stand there and absorb what had just happened. The weight of the past few minutes pressed against her ribs, heavy and strange. Not long ago, she had been humiliated, turned away with nothing, forced to once again face the cold reality that kindness was often conditional, that compassion had limits, and yet, standing here now, groceries in hand, she knew something had changed. Not just for her, for everyone. Behind the glass storefront, the store owner remained frozen in place. He was still standing behind the counter, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. His jaw was set, his eyes locked on the money still sitting there, untouched. He had taken the cash, he had packed the bag, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss of control, a loss of authority, a loss of something he hadn't even realized he had been holding on to so tightly. The other customers had begun to stir, shifting in place, their movements slow and careful, as if uncertain of what was supposed to happen next. The middle-aged woman who had bought the cookies was the first to speak. "That was the right thing to do," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone in particular. The man in the work boots, the one who had quietly placed a few bills on the counter, nodded. He had spent the past few minutes watching, hesitating, wondering if it was even his place to say something. But now the hesitation was gone. "This could have gone differently," he muttered, adjusting his grip on the plastic bag in his hand. His voice was low, thoughtful. "Could have been worse." The store owner didn't respond. The words lingered in the air, stretching the moment further. And then, without waiting for a reply, the woman with the cookies turned and left the store, pushing through the door and stepping into the night. The man in the work boots followed, then another customer, then another, and just like that, the store was empty. For the first time in years, the owner felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Regret, not for the money, not for the groceries, but for the moment itself, for the way he had handled it, for the way the night had unfolded. Outside, the air felt lighter. The woman stood at the curb, watching as people filtered out of the store, their footsteps quieter than usual. Her son had stopped pulling at her coat, and instead, he looked up at her. His small hands clutched around the pack of cookies like a treasure. She exhaled, her breath visible in the cold night air. Then, finally, she turned, and she walked away. Not with her head down, not with her shoulders hunched, but with the quiet strength of someone who had seen, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that she wasn't alone. That there were people, strangers, willing to stand up, to choose kindness, to fight for the moments that mattered. A few steps away, Barack and Michelle watched her go, their expressions calm but knowing. Michelle let out a slow breath, crossing her arms over her chest. "She'll be okay," she murmured. Barack nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Yeah," he said quietly, "she will." They stood there for a moment longer, watching as the city moved on, as the moment settled into memory. Then, without a word, they turned and began to walk. The night was still young, and there was still work to do. The cold night air carried the weight of the moment, stretching across the quiet street as the last few customers trickled out of the store. Their faces were thoughtful, their footsteps slower than before, as if they were still processing what had just happened. Some exchanged hushed words, others simply walked away, but none of them would forget this night. Inside, the store owner remained behind the counter, his hands pressed flat against the surface, his eyes locked on the crumpled bills and neatly stacked coins left there. The store was empty now, but the echo of what had transpired still lingered. It clung to the walls, settled in the air like dust that refused to settle. He wasn't used to this feeling. For years, he had prided himself on running his business the way he saw fit. He made the rules. He decided who stayed and who left. He had always believed that was the only way to survive in a place like this, by being firm, by setting boundaries, by ensuring that no one took advantage of him. And yet, tonight, he had felt something shift beneath him. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about the woman. It was about the choice, the way people had reacted, the way the room had changed, the way a simple moment had turned into something far bigger than he had expected. His jaw clenched, and he reached forward, gathering the money and counting it out. There was more than enough to cover the groceries, more than enough to cover everything. $100 bill, crisp and unfolded. Smaller bills, wrinkled but sincere. A few loose coins, added by those who might not have had much to give but had chosen to anyway. His fingers hovered over the cash register. For a fleeting second, a thought crossed his mind. He could take the money. No one would know. He could put it in the drawer and pretend this had never happened. Pretend he had never been challenged, never been made to feel as if he had done something wrong. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. The truth was that he had been given a chance, a rare, uncomfortable, undeniable chance. To be better, to change, to decide what kind of man he wanted to be when the next struggling mother walked through that door. He exhaled, long and slow, and without another thought he pushed the money into the register, shutting the drawer with a quiet finality. Outside, the young mother and her son had disappeared into the night, their silhouettes swallowed by the distant glow of streetlights. But Barack and Michelle remained. They stood near the curb, watching the world move on around them, watching as the moment settled into something more than just a fleeting act of kindness. Michelle glanced back toward the store one last time, her gaze lingering on the darkened window where the owner still stood, unmoving, lost in his thoughts. She didn't need to say anything. She knew. Change didn't happen overnight, but it started somewhere. And sometimes it started like this, with a challenge, with a choice, with one simple act of defiance against the belief that the world couldn't be better. Barack slid his hands into his pockets and let out a quiet chuckle. "You think he'll get it?" he asked. Michelle smiled, shaking her head just slightly. "Maybe not today," she admitted, "but he's thinking about it now. And that's more than he was doing an hour ago." Barack nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's how it starts. A slow breath, a quiet victory, a seed planted in the soil of someone's conscience waiting for the right moment to grow. And as they turned, as they walked side by side down the dimly lit street, they knew one thing for certain. The world didn't change because of grand gestures alone. It changed because of moments like these, small, simple, unforgettable. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Watch the next video or explore more on the channel. And if this story moved you, share it with others.